I'm Kevin Gaffney. I'm Leonard Kaplan's guest on What Do You Want to Do?
Welcome to What Do You Want to Do, the show that will hopefully help you figure out what you want to do in life or reconnect you to what you love doing. Each show has a guest who is doing what they want to do, whether it's in their career or in addition to their regular job. Most importantly, we want to help you realize that no matter your age, you too can do what you want to do if you have the will to do it. Now here's your host, Leonard Kaplan.
Here we are again, show number 48, and my guest this week is Kevin Gaffny, who is an airline pilot. I dare any talk show host to find an airline pilot to be a guest. Kevin, welcome to What Do You Want to Do?
Oh, thanks for having me, Lynn. I appreciate it.
And What Do You Want to Do is the show that, if you have never watched the show or heard the show, shows people what's possible when they have a goal and when they have a dream. And sometimes people go away from their dream. Sometimes they discover it late in life. And with each interview, it's an individual story. There's no two stories that are alike. That's what's fun about doing this show. So, Kevin, when did you know or discover that you had a love for flying?
Well, I consider myself very fortunate to have found out early that I had a love of flying. We both grew up in Revere, Massachusetts. As a youth, my mother, for entertainment, would drag myself, my brother, and my two sisters down to Revere Beach while my dad was off working for some free entertainment and swimming in the ocean. And of course, the airplanes are pretty low going in and out of Logan over Revere Beach. And I used to always find myself fascinated looking up in the airplane. I never, ever thought about the folks in the back. It was always about the folks up front. And I was, wow, that's pretty cool. They're leaving Boston now. I wonder where they're going. They're getting to fly this great big airplane. They're flying really fast. They're traveling all the way across the country in just a couple of hours. And I always wondered, what is it they're going to do when they get there? And now I know. So I was probably 8 or 9 when I started to get fascinated with it. By the time I was in high school, which I went to high school in East Boston, right by the airport, I often would find myself daydreaming about the airplanes because we could hear the noise. We could smell the kerosene from the jet fuel when the windows were open and whatnot. It's just said, I don't know how I'm going to do it, but that's what I want to do.
That's amazing. And you were 8 years old, you say?
8 years old down the beach, and a little older than that when I got to high school.
Amazing. Amazing. So you bring to mind, and I mention my dad a lot on this show because there's a lot of great memories with my dad, and he's responsible for who I am today and where I am, I think, And every Sunday with my dad, he used to take me to the airport to watch the planes. And back then, they were propeller planes. There were no jets, at least not where we were looking. But we used to watch them land and watch them take off. So your experience actually it propelled you, like that little pun there. It propelled you into your career. Very interesting.
Absolutely. And I did start off in propeller-driven airplanes.
Really?
Small. You start your training. Of course, it's expensive to fly, so you start your training in small propeller airplanes. If you're not a rather large individual and your instructor is not, you start in the smallest two-seater you can find because it's the cheapest. It's the cheapest way to get in the air, and it takes a lot of hours and a lot of money to eventually to land your dream job, the one that I have now.
Did you talk to your friends about it and your parents, and what was the reaction when you first expressed this goal?
It's funny. My dad, my parents always supported me with everything that I do. Very rarely did they ever say, no, you can't do this or you can't try to do that. That being said, my mother always wanted me to be a dentist. So
quite a difference.
Yes, quite a difference. I was never interested in being a dentist. I don't mind brushing my own teeth, but that's about as far as I'm going to go with that.
Wow. Now, did you ever consider joining the Air Force? Because that would have not cost you money and they would have trained you to fly, right?
Absolutely. I did. I wanted to, you could actually fly with not just the Air Force, but also the Navy, the Marines, and the Army. At the time that I was graduating high school, it was the end of the 80s. The Cold War was running down. The economy was starting to get a little bit rocky, and there were a lot of budget cuts. Finding a slot in the military, even during good financial times, is very difficult because there's only so many spots and there's so many people competing for those spots. And to compete, your grades have to be top notch. Mine were very good, but your grades have to be perfect. Your physical health has to be perfect. I don't have any ailments or anything, but I wear glasses. That's something at that point in time, which would be disqualifying for a fighter pilot. There are other airplanes you could fly as well, but the coveted slots were extremely challenging to get, very difficult, very competitive. And my attempt at that route was not successful. As a young man, of course, you talk to a recruiter and they would tell me, I talked to the Air Force recruiter and I talked to the Navy recruiter. I did well on the tests to get in. They suggested I enlist and figure out the flying later, which even at 18 didn't sound like the way to go.
Right.
You're making a pretty big commitment, but you're not getting a guarantee to do what you want to do. I love this country and I wouldn't have minded serving, but flying is really what I wanted to do. So instead of the military, I went to Bridgewater State College right here in Massachusetts. It was Plan B, and that was the next economical thing to do. In-state tuition with flight training on top of that was dramatically different, as you can imagine, than tuition bills today.
So did you get trained at college, or did you have a separate school for that?
A little bit of both, if that makes any sense. So I went to Bridgewater and I graduated with a bachelor's degree in management science with an aviation concentration. So my degree is actually in management, and on the side concurrently at the airport in Taunton, I took flying lessons where I actually received college credit. There's a curriculum developed. Without boring you with numbers, the FAA allows you to train under certain rules. One is called Part 91 and one is called Part 141. 141 is a very structured course, which is what I did, and was allowed to get college credits in stages along with my flight training, working towards ratings and certificates.
So I did this with my last guest who became a DJ late in his life. And I'm going to ask you the same kind of a question. What was if you can think back, your first time actually flying with you driving? What did that feel like? What was your reaction?
It's thrilling. I'm going to give you, there's really two firsts, if you can believe it. The first is the actual physical flight with your instructor. And I took my first lesson actually in Beverly, Mass. I attempted to get a head start, not knowing about the college credit portion. So I went to the Beverly Airport and I signed up for flight school there. And I actually did about 12 hours of training up there prior to going into the aviation program in Bridgewater, only to learn then that they weren't going to accept credits. So I had to switch. But the first time that I was in the airplane, it was absolutely thrilling. I don't think we were off the ground for more than a minute where the instructor allowed me to take the controls and start flying the airplane. And I was just thrilled. I mean, if you can think back to when you were a kid on your birthday and you get that special gift to open up the same joy that you feel when you open that up and you got what you wanted, very similar to that, extremely exciting. The second instance would be the first time I soloed, which means I was the only one on the airplane. And that was just as thrilling until I looked next to me and there was no one in the seat next to me. I was on my own.
Wow. Oh yeah, I can't imagine. Wow. That's now all these years later, how is the feeling different?
Well, the training portion of flying, they call that general aviation, but what I do now is commercial aviation. And general aviation has a lot of freedom with it. You decide where you're going to go. You decide when you're going to go. You decide how long you're going to be away. You decide when it is you're going to come back, but you also have to pay for it, and it's not cheap.
Yeah.
Now I go where I don't want to say where I'm told to go. We bid our schedules monthly on a computer, and everything is done based on seniority. So the first person hired gets whatever schedule they want, and the last person hired gets whatever's left over. I'm kind of in the middle, so I get a lot of what I want. And when I say what I want, there's really no bad flying. It's all about what days off you want. Do you prefer to get up really early in the morning, or would you prefer to fly late at night? Those are the things that your seniority affords you. I'm a morning person. It doesn't bother me to get up as early as possible. Staying up overnight all night long is difficult. But that would be the difference. The difference would be you're on your own, but you're paying for it yourself, as opposed to someone else is paying for it and they're also paying you a salary so that you can support yourself. But you go where they say to go, which is great, because a lot of times pre-pandemic, that would be Europe or South America, Africa, or even the continent of the United States.
Now, do you get to see any of the places that you go to? Is there enough time in your layover? If they call it a layover?
They do call it a layover.
Okay.
There's plenty of time. Now, the FAA requires a minimum of 10 hours on the ground for an overnight, which allows you 8 hours of what they call behind the door, so that an opportunity to sleep.
Yeah.
Typically, when I go to international destinations, I typically have anywhere from 24 to 30 hours on the ground. So it's plenty of time to see things and get to see a lot. Domestically, sometimes you'll have a 20 or 30 hour layover on the ground, and sometimes it's only 12 hours. But there's domestically, I've been to every state in the country a lot of times. So it's more about getting into the hotel, getting something to eat, calling home, saying hello to my wife, and then going to bed.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it's
wow.
The younger guys like to hit the ground running, and so not that I'm old, but the 20 and 30 something year olds, they like to get out and see all that they can see. For me, one of the great things about this is you get to see at least a little bit, so you can decide for yourself, is this a place that's worth taking a vacation to come back and explore, or could I see enough of it on just an overnight?
Now, if I'm not mistaken, you and your wife went to Iceland.
Absolutely.
So
we did.
That's a place that you discovered on your job?
No, I actually was watching television, and a commercial came on for Iceland Air. Iceland Air is, I don't want to say it's owned by the country, but it's kind of subsidized by the country. And they try to increase their tourism for revenue, because the island's big, but the population is small and the industries are few. But it's a beautiful place. It's all volcanic. A lot of people in my business will tell you that Iceland should be called Greenland and Greenland should be called Iceland, because for descriptive purposes. So Iceland's not ice. It's mostly volcanic. It's got a lot of interesting formations. There's a lot to do. They do a lot of off-road, four-wheel drive terrain type vehicles for tours. You can see active volcanoes. You can get pretty close to lava. They have hot springs under the ground near the coast. So you can actually be, when it's 45 degrees and raining, you can actually be sitting in the ocean, and the temperature of the water is 103 degrees.
No kidding.
So it's interesting. It's interesting. It's a fascinating place to go. And if anybody that's listening has never been there, it's worth it.
Huh. Let's get a little serious for a minute, because I know there have been a lot of changes due to terrorism and things like that. What has changed the most in your job since 9/11 and all these other terrible things?
I would say that the biggest thing that changed at first was the passengers' awareness. I remember shortly after 9/11, sitting in the back of an airplane commuting to work. And if you had to get up and use the lavatory, everybody in the airplane stopped what they were doing and looked. Now, before, if you can think back to the 70s and the 80s, the few hijackings we heard about, it was typically someone trying to make a political statement, and very rarely did it end in anybody getting injured. Obviously, with 9/11, not only did a lot of people get injured, a lot of people got killed. So it was, I'd have to say, passionate or alertness. However, nowadays, the cell phone has eradicated that. Too many people are busy staring at their electronic device to pay too much attention to what's going on. But the good thing is the airlines and the government have done a whole lot of other things, which unfortunately we're not allowed to discuss to mitigate safety issues.
Well, that's understandable.
We don't want them knowing what the plan is.
Exactly. Right. So let's go back to your training. Do you start with little planes and then progress to the big giant ones? And do they teach you parachuting and stuff like that?
They don't. Parachuting is not mandatory. Anybody can learn that on their own. You don't have to be a pilot to do it. So no, it's not a requirement. Military, it would be a requirement if you went that route. But airline carriers, you can put that on your resume. It's not going to help you or hurt you as far as getting an airline pilot job. Most people do start in small airplanes, and it's mostly because it's cost prohibitive to fly bigger airplanes. However, if Elon Musk were to decide to take flying lessons, he could probably start in a Gulfstream, because I don't think he's cost prohibited. So right. Yeah, you typically would go in the smallest airplane that you could get into, because your costs will be cheaper. The biggest issue would be with small airplanes. With any airplane, we have to do weight and balance performance before we get in the airplane. If you could think of a seesaw when you were a little kid, if you got on a seesaw with your friend from next door and you were roughly the same size and same weight, the two of you could sit there and it would be balanced. An airplane's kind of the same way, except it's not just two kids. It's 100 to 250 kids, and you have to put them in the right place in the seesaw. Otherwise, one end of the seesaw is sitting on the ground and the other one's up in the air. That's exactly what happens with an airplane, and you don't want to have it on the ground or in the air. The performance is just not going to be there. It'd be disastrous. So flying in a smaller plane is the best way to go. I learned in a two-seater out of college, not making tons of money in college and having to pay for flight training. I was a bit thinner than I am now, so I didn't weigh a whole lot. So I was able to go in just a two-seat airplane. But if you happen to be a NFL football player, a two-seater is not going to work for you. You're going to have to find something bigger, and that's the reason why. Weight and balance.
Have you ever flown a helicopter? Have you ever considered flying one?
I've never flown a helicopter. Helicopters are fascinating. When I started flying, the goal was always to be an airline pilot. Also, there weren't a whole lot of helicopter jobs. Most of the jobs in the 70s and the 80s that were helicopter jobs were taken up by military folks that, the guys that were in Vietnam. They were still pretty young back then. So there wasn't, at least I didn't see a career path doing that as far as getting a job, a stable job, and one that would, allow me to live the life that I wanted to live while enjoying the job that I wanted to do in order to enjoy that life.
While you were in the air, what is your funniest experience, if there is one?
There's always funny experiences. I worked years ago for a company called Cape Air. And for those that may or may not be familiar with Cape Air, that like television and remember a sitcom called Wings. Do you remember that one?
I love that show. Yeah.
Okay, so Cape Air was a slightly more professional version of the Hackett brothers. And I flew a Cessna 402, which was the airplane that you see them using. So it's just one pilot. There's no flight attendant.
Uh-huh.
There's no cockpit door. You interact with the passengers, and you have to do the safety demonstration with the passengers. You get to chat with them, which is fun no matter what plane you're flying with, getting to interact with the passengers. I enjoy that aspect of the job. But what was funny was this older woman got in the airplane, and she was a little bit nervous and apprehensive. Of course, she looked at me, and I looked like I was fresh out of high school. And she looked over her glasses and she said, "Sonny, are you old enough to fly this airplane?" And I said, "Well,
wow.
ma'am," I said, I got all the manuals and read them last night. This is my first flight. We'll see how it goes."
Oh, that's
After
funny.
her dentures almost fell out of her mouth and she almost grabbed her chest, I said, maybe that wasn't a good idea.
Oh my, yeah, that little joke wasn't a joke to her, I guess. Wow, that's
No,
so
she
funny.
did find it funny. She felt a little bit better about it. She enjoyed the
Yeah.
short flight and she thanked me for it.
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good. I've been on those flights. I remember when I was a kid, my parents took me to Puerto Rico, and my mother and I flew from Puerto Rico, San Juan, to St. Thomas, and there was a lot of sightseeing to do on there, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's a beautiful flight too. Low
Yeah.
altitude, you get to see the ocean, you get to see the islands.
Yes.
Pretty neat.
I was fascinated by the ocean turning from blue to green blue when we got to the Caribbean, very, very interesting. So now I know my limited knowledge here, you rely on instruments as well as your sight when you're navigating, correct?
Absolutely.
So if in the worst case scenario, the instruments stop working, could you get where you're going by your eye? Because you're really high up there.
Anytime that you can visually see out of the window from wherever it is that you're at to wherever it is that you have to land the airplane, you can do it without instrumentation. If you have to go through clouds, you need instrumentation.
Yeah.
Because of that, we have 2 of everything, sometimes 3 of everything. They operate off independent systems and multiple systems. So the likelihood of that scenario actually presenting itself is not very high.
Right.
And we also train for partial instrument. But when you learn to fly, you learn to fly first visually. Everything is visual. You're not told to look inside at the instruments. So you look out at the horizon, and you base your climbs on the horizon, your turns on the horizon, your descents on the horizon, and straight and level on the horizon, based on how you would show. For instance, if I was going to teach you to fly, one of the first things I would do is I would take you up, I would level the airplane off, and I would say, "Okay, Len, look at the horizon, where the ocean and the sky are meeting out there." And then what I would do up on the dashboard is I would put my hand up here. The way you sit from the dashboard to your fingers, you'll find a reference point where if you put the horizon on this finger, for instance, and just hold it there, you'll maintain your altitude. You don't have to look at the altimeter. And for me, that was always 3 fingers. For some people, it's 4 fingers. For some people, it's 2.5 fingers. The point is, if you keep your seat in the same spot all the time, in the same airplane, that reference is always going to work for you.
Now, here's a question, and I know weather can play a big part in whether you actually go up or not. What is the type of weather that will absolutely make you not fly?
Freezing ice pellets
Okay.
is something that would ground us. We have de-icing fluids, but when it comes to freezing ice pellets, especially at night in temperatures below 0, the glycol that we use is not able to give us the margin of safety that we would need to consider making the flight. The other things that are restrictive are visibilities, and that's different for everybody. It depends on your licensing. It depends on the airplane's capabilities. It depends on the airport's instrument guidance systems capabilities. It depends on the carrier that you're working for and what their agreement is with the FAA, based on the FAA inspecting their program, watching how they train, being satisfied that you're allowed to go to a certain point. Typically, for the company that I work for right now, you need 500-foot forward visibility to even take off. Anything less than that, you're not going to be able to go. We can land less than that. I should say we can shoot and approach less than that, but you can't land 0-0. You need about 600 feet of forward visibility by the time you get on the runway to come in and land.
So it's mostly the visibility, not the wind or anything like that.
It is. Well, wind can be restrictive. Visibility is more restrictive because it's more defined for all aircraft. It's a one size fits all thing. However, wind is not a one size fits all thing. You could have a 20-knot crosswind and be flying in a small two-seater, and that's going to be too much for the airplane to overcome. The airplane that I fly, we're certified up to a 40-knot direct crosswind, and we can still come in and land, and it's not going to be a problem.
So when there's like a hurricane down here, if you go above the clouds, does all that go away? Like you get a certain altitude, it's smooth?
Generally, not all the time. The great thing about weather, as you know, living in New England, is it's not uniform and it's always changing.
That's for sure.
Typically, if you're in a steady rain or a low pressure system that gives you consistency, the ride typically is not that bad. When you're in convective activity, you want to stay as far away from that as possible, meaning thunderstorms. There's a lot of uplifting action. The clouds, it's very violent inside those clouds. Man can build anything that man wants to as strong as they can, and Mother Nature can tear it apart.
Yeah.
So thunderstorms are not anything to mess with. We do our very best to stay completely out of them and away from them. And you don't have to be in them to be affected by them. You only have to be in the vicinity of them. That's how violent the weather can be with a thunderstorm.
Now, with your experience, I would think that you or any pilot would be potential candidates for going into space. Would you ever consider that?
I would consider going into space under the right circumstances. I don't know if the opportunity would ever present itself. I'm certainly not in a position to shell out the kind of money that
Yeah, sure.
that some of the people who are endeavoring to endeavor into space are charging. Pretty neat. It'd be absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to do it. And I'll settle for talking to someone who's done it. I would love to do that as well. It's pretty fascinating.
Much like this interview is fascinating for me because I don't think I'll ever be flying a plane. It's
you never know.
Next best. Well, I don't. I'm questioning my ability to drive a car at this point. My eyes are so bad, so I don't think so. Let's talk about the COVID and how that might have affected. It definitely affected your business. What's the story? How did it affect you personally and the airline business?
COVID devastated the airline business. The airline business in general is a very unstable business. If you look back over the decades, airlines turn profits for several years, and then they lose money for several years. Then they turn profits for several years, and they lose money for several years. Over the in the early 2000s, a lot of companies consolidated. A lot of them merged. There were a lot of bankruptcies, and at least what we call the three legacy carriers, they emerged pretty strong and were making a lot of money, and then they came to a grounding halt due to the COVID. And COVID, everybody stopped moving. Everybody's, not only were people not flying, people were not leaving the house, as you know. So airplanes are expensive. Most companies don't own their airplanes. They're paying leases on them. If you're not flying your airplane and you don't have people in the airplane, it makes it very challenging to pay the lease. I'll say it on behalf of my industry. Thank you to the taxpayer, because you allowed most of us to keep our job.
Thanks for joining me on part one of What Do You Want to Do with Kevin Gaffny, the airplane pilot. Next week is part two, so tune in for that. And until then, what do you want to do?